Now it's time for The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry that you did not get the transcript of today's court proceedings in time for your hour tonight. I have it right here. Does it pain you that I have it in my hands? I shouldn't have.
I have the rage.
No, I've heard about that. I saw your exchange with
the
Ali.
wrath. It's the rage. No, this is really just jealousy. It's a different thing. I'm turning green,
it's
not
a very
red.
different thing. So I just got this 10 minutes ago. Okay, and let me just give you this. Okay, let me just give you the last line.
Okay.
The last line spoken by the defense.
Okay.
Today, to the jury. The government has not met their burden beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Manafort knowingly and willfully filed false returns or knowingly or willfully failed to file FBARs. He then went on to thank the jury. The last line from the prosecution, last words the juries heard from one of the lawyers in the case before the judge took over with his instructions. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is what controls. It's the evidence that comes from that witness stand, and it leads to only one conclusion, and that is that Mr. Manafort is guilty and guilty as charged.
One of those sounds very Perry Mason, and one of those doesn't.
Which one?
The one that didn't say FBAR, which actually might be an FEC banned acronym.
Well, you see the emphasis there. The evidence is the evidence that comes from that witness stand where Paul Manafort never sat and where no witnesses appeared for the defense. Everything you're supposed to take from this case comes from that witness stand. The defense gave you nothing.
You know, everybody keeps telling us, all the legal experts keep telling us that it is not that weird that the defense didn't mount a defense. But the defense didn't mount a defense. And they do, no matter what happens here, have to be looking down the barrel at the next federal criminal trial for Paul Manafort that is due to start in just a few weeks, just a few miles away in Washington, D.C. The idea that they might try not mounting a defense and that might fail here would set them up in D.C. to have to mount a defense, although they would be coming at it from a place of weakness because they just lost their previous case in an adjoining district. I mean, I don't envy these guys.
No, it's a perfectly reasonable tactic to not mount a defense, but there's no lawyer who's going to tell you that that tactic improves the statistical likelihood of a not guilty verdict.
Yeah.
In fact, it reduces it rather dramatically.
Yeah.
If you look at the cases where there's no defense presented, that makes it much less likely to get to the not guilty. But Rachel, we're going to be covering this, many other things tonight. Steve Schmidt is here. He wants to talk about what happened to John Brennan today, and you know Steve Schmidt, and I think you know he has something to say about this.
Yes, and credit to you, my friend, for having been a part of this story in terms of John Brennan's last public comments last night before this happened today, happening on The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. You're in the middle of this one like you are in the middle of a lot of these. I am very much looking forward to your coverage tonight.
And Rachel, you're going to be in the middle of the transcript as soon as you leave your desk.
I'm coming to steal your copy.
No, they're going to hand it. They have one for you. They're going to hand it to you, and that's what you're going to do instead of sleeping tonight.
If they don't have a copy of mine, I'm taking yours.
They do. They do. Okay.
Thank you,
Rachel. I will not relent. When the history of Robert Mueller's investigation of the President of the United States is written, we will surely discover that every time President Trump's TV lawyer Rudy Giuliani publicly threatened Robert Mueller, as he did today, publicly demanded that the investigation end, as he did today, every time Rudy Giuliani did that, Robert Mueller thought to himself, I will not relent. History will probably tell us that. That's what Omarosa seems to be thinking now that the president is suing Omarosa to try to shut her up, to stop her from repeatedly going on television and playing her secretly recorded audio of conversations that include Trump campaign staffers sharing the firm belief with Omarosa that Donald Trump has definitely said the N-word and has probably been recorded saying the N-word. I will not relent. Starting to sound like Omarosa's motto this week. The president has never attacked anyone more viciously than he has attacked Omarosa this week, trying to get her to shut up. I won't repeat what he has called her. The whole world knows the words that the president has chosen. Disgusting language. It is Trump at his most publicly vile, but he does not seem to be scaring Omarosa. She will be back on television tomorrow, possibly with more secret recordings. She seems to be thinking, I will not relent. That was the unifying feeling that was going through the minds of the millions and millions and millions of people in the United States and around the world who rose up in resistance to President Trump the day after he was inaugurated. I will not relent. And if you criticize Donald Trump publicly, he is going to do everything he possibly can to crush you. So the one thing you need to know about yourself before you criticize Donald Trump is, I will not relent. Former CIA Director John Brennan knew exactly who he was dealing with when he decided to start publicly criticizing President Trump. John Brennan knows much more about Donald Trump than Donald Trump wants him to know. John Brennan knows much more about Donald Trump than John Brennan can say publicly. As CIA Director John Brennan was in the group of Obama administration intelligence officials who briefed President-elect Trump at Trump Tower 2 weeks before his inauguration. That was the day that James Comey was left alone in the room to brief Donald Trump specifically on a dossier that had been circulating around Washington that described Donald Trump's connections to Russians, including an unsubstantiated account of a night Donald Trump allegedly spent at a Moscow hotel in the company of Russian prostitutes. John Brennan is now our senior national security and intelligence analyst for MSNBC and NBC News, and he surely knew when he began sharply criticizing President Trump this year that Donald Trump was going to strike back. Donald Trump was going to hit John Brennan as hard as he could, and John Brennan has no doubt known from the start what he would say when the day came that Donald Trump hit John Brennan as hard as he could, and that day was today. And John Brennan immediately said, I will not relent. The straw that broke the camel's back, as Rachel was just suggesting, for Donald Trump was John Brennan's first appearance on this program at this hour last night. Here is the last thing that John Brennan said publicly before President Trump stripped him of his security clearance today.
First, I think Donald Trump has badly sullied the reputation of the office of the presidency with his invective, with his constant disregard, I think, for human decency, as well as his befriending of autocratic leaders around the world, and his continued pursuit of relationships to benefit himself as opposed to the country. I do think that America's standing in the world has also been tarnished. But I think even more fundamentally, what he is doing here in the United States is very polarizing, and he is, I think, the most divisive president we've ever had in the Oval Office. He is feeding and fueling hatred and animosity and misunderstandings among Americans. And so I am very concerned when I look at some of the tweets that are out there and commentary. We are just fighting with each other as a nation.
And so today, a hastily scheduled White House press briefing began this way.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by reading a statement from the President. As the head of the executive branch and commander-in-chief, I have a unique constitutional responsibility to protect the nation's classified information, including by controlling access to it. Today, in fulfilling that responsibility, I've decided to revoke the security clearance of John Brennan, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Brennan has recently leveraged his status as a former high-ranking official with access to highly sensitive information to make a series of unfounded and outrageous allegations, wild outbursts on the internet and television about this administration.
John Brennan learned of the president's action after friends alerted him to the White House press briefing announcement, and his first response was on Twitter. John Brennan said, "This action is part of a broader effort by Mr. Trump to suppress freedom of speech and punish critics. It should gravely worry all Americans, including intelligence professionals, about the cost of speaking out. My principles are worth far more than clearances. I will not relent." John Brennan's first interview after the White House announcement today was by phone with MSNBC's Nicole Wallace.
Revoking my security clearances is his way of trying to get back at me. But I think I have tried to voice the concerns of millions of Americans about Mr. Trump's failures. in terms of fulfilling the responsibilities of that sacred and solemn office of the presidency. And this is not going to deter me at all. I'm going to continue to speak out. But I am very worried about the message that it appears that Mr. Trump is trying to send to others, and including those that currently hold security clearances within the government. I've seen this type of behavior and actions on the part of foreign tyrants and despots and autocrats for many, many years during my CIA and national security career. I never, ever thought that I would see it here in the United States.
Leading off our discussion now, Steve Schmidt, former Republican strategist, and Malcolm Nance, author of the new book, The Plot to Destroy Democracy. They are both MSNBC contributors. And Steve Schmidt, your reaction to what the president did today with John Brennan's security clearance?
Well, it's an abuse of power. It's retribution against a political opponent by the President of the United States, an autocratic president, one who encourages his followers in chants of lock her up or lock him up against political opponents. John Brennan is an American patriot. He has served America honorably, far more honorably than Donald Trump has. And what's true about this is that when you look at an administration where Omarosa or Jared Kushner or Ivanka Trump have security clearances and John Brennan does not, then you know something is askew and amiss. But look, he has an enemies list, and he's clearly targeting the enemies list. And have no doubt, if Donald Trump could send out secret police to handcuff and arrest John Brennan, perhaps me, perhaps many others who speak out against this president, have no doubt he would likely do it. And that's the point here. It's the abuse of power, but also the power that he has that he's unable to abuse, but would if he could, that we ought to be having a discussion about in this country.
Malcolm Nance, what did the nation's intelligence service lose with this decision in terms of its ability to confer with a former CIA director over matters that the CIA director might have unique knowledge?
Well, it loses a body of knowledge. It loses corporate knowledge. I want to point something out about John Brennan. I know John Brennan. I've met John Brennan several times. John Brennan is the man that killed Osama bin Laden at the order of President Barack Obama by integrating CIA assets, producing the intelligence, passing that intelligence on to our special mission war fighters, and executing that mission. He has unique intelligence knowledge, which must be shared with his successors, and his opinion, which should be brought forth whenever this nation needs to defend itself. Donald Trump does not concern himself with the protection of this nation. He concerns himself with the protection of Donald Trump. And so he allows, as Steve said, people like Jared Kushner, who made contact with the Russians and asked for secure cryptographic communications to hide his back channel from the CIA and the NSA. He should not be cleared. John Brennan should be cleared. At this point, Donald Trump has given more top-secret information to the Russians just through inadvertent disclosure than the clearance that John Brennan has had. So this is an anathema.
Let's listen to what John Brennan told Nicole Wallace today about his service to both Democratic and Republican presidents and the way he thinks this is actually the way this feels for him today. Let's listen to this.
I served for 6 presidents, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And I don't think there was ever a time that any intelligence or law enforcement or national security professional questioned whether the President of the United States was taking their information seriously. So this is, I think, a sad time. We will come out from it under it. I am very confident in the resilience of this and the strength of this nation. Mr. Trump is not going to bring this country down.
Steve Schmidt, John Brennan, sad but confident.
Well, look, Lawrence, I think that one of the things that we have to do as a country is to recognize how abnormal all of this is and to talk seriously with each other about a president who is purposely divisive, who pits Americans against each other, who incites the worst instincts and the worst impulses in the country, and to look around the world and to ask a question. is the country in decline. And when you look at the signs, it's hard to argue that we are not, and that there's a fundamental choice lying ahead for the American people in what I would argue is the most important midterm election in American history coming in November, and then the most important presidential election since the election of 1864, which was frankly a referendum on whether we would continue to be a country or not. The next presidential election will mark a choice for this country about whether it goes down a path of inexorable decline or begins an era of renewal following Donald Trump. He is right that it is a resilient country, and John Brennan is right to have faith in America, but our inheritance that was given to us by such sacrifice by generation of American patriots is not an entitlement. We are not guaranteed greatness in our future. And when you have a president as reckless, as incompetent, as mean-spirited as Donald Trump, when you see the brokenness in our politics, the pitting of American against American to the degree that we're seeing, it is not necessarily the case that everything is going to be okay. And I think there's a real lack of imagination in the country's mind about the damage that a president as incompetent, reckless, ignorant as this one could cause in the world. So I appreciate the director's optimism, but I'm someone who is deeply concerned, deeply worried about the trajectory that this vile president has the country on.
Let's listen to more of what John Brennan told Nicole Wallace, talking about the president's dishonesty, his lack of integrity, his nastiness, especially the nastiness we've seen in the last couple of days. Let's listen to this.
I must tell you that Mr. Trump's dishonesty, his lack of integrity, his nastiness, mean-spiritedness, the types of things that he has just tweeted out over the past 72 hours, the terms that he uses, this is not what I think of American presidents, nor of America. We're better than this. We have to be better than this. And we have been a shining example to the world, and Mr. Trump is letting this country down.
Malcolm Nance, John Brennan pleading that we are better than this.
And we are better than this. I mean, we are absolutely better than this. And what breaks my heart is that there are right now hundreds of intelligence watchstanders around the world watching this program, listening to these words, thinking that their careers, their dedication, working in the dark, their selflessness, which they ask for no public recognition, can just be tossed away because of a political whim. And if it can happen to the highest person at the CIA, even though he's a former director, it can happen to the average watchstander. And it might be happening. I mean, you know, this administration almost immediately deployed political commissars early on. Steve Schmidt is right. This administration is incompetent, and their incompetence shows their meanness, their ruthlessness, and their utter villainy to a certain extent. But you know, I'm in Philadelphia, and every time I come here, where I was born, I'm just reminded back to the Declaration of Independence, which addressed this at one time, where I paraphrase, you know, a prince with the characteristics that's marked such as a tyrant is unfit to be the leader of a free people, and that's where we are.
Malcolm Nance, Steve Schmidt, thank you for leading us off tonight. Really appreciate it. When we come back, why tomorrow is going to be, without a doubt, the single most agonizing day Donald Trump has experienced in the White House. And President Trump knew he was in trouble this morning when Fox and Friends turned on him. We have the video. And we don't have a recording of Donald Trump saying the N-word, but we have something else that he said in 1989 about being black. You really want to hear him say this. And at the end of our hour tonight, we will have a very special last word tonight. Agony. That's what Donald Trump is in for tomorrow. Sheer agony. Tomorrow is going to be Donald Trump's most agonizing day in the presidency because beginning at 9:30 a.m., 6 men and 6 women will start their jury deliberations in the case of the United States of America versus Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort's future will be on the line in that jury room tomorrow, and so will Donald Trump's. That's what Rudy Giuliani and President Trump apparently believe, according to reporting tonight in the Washington Post, in which Rudy Giuliani said the first jury verdict obtained by Robert Mueller's team of prosecutors could determine the future of the Mueller investigation and the Mueller investigators. Giuliani told the Washington Post, quote, "They're empowered if they win and defeated if they lose." Imagine Donald Trump's joy if a jury rejects Robert Mueller's first prosecution in court. And imagine Donald Trump's rage if a jury hits Paul Manafort with the word guilty. And imagine Donald Trump's personal agony tomorrow, starting at 9:30 a.m. as he awaits that jury verdict. In final arguments today, the prosecution told the jury the star witness in this case is the documents that the prosecution says prove that Paul Manafort committed tax fraud and bank fraud, the documents that show $60 million in income to Paul Manafort from Ukrainian oligarchs with zero taxes paid on that income, the documents that show Paul Manafort lying about his assets in applications for bank loans, the documents that show Paul Manafort maintaining foreign bank accounts, which he did not reveal to the government as required by law, the documents that show Paul Manafort deliberately lying to his bookkeeper and his accountants. The defense tried to make the case all about Rick Gates, Paul Manafort's former assistant, who has already pleaded guilty in the case to lying to the FBI. The prosecution said when Paul Manafort was hiring Rick Gates to work for him, he deliberately chose someone who would break the law along with Paul Manafort. The prosecution said about Rick Gates, about Paul Manafort hiring Rick Gates, he didn't choose a Boy Scout. The prosecutors made no public comment today, but one of Paul Manafort's lawyers, who did not call a single witness in defense of Paul Manafort, said only this.
Mr. Manafort was very happy with how things went today. His defense team got to address the jury, point out the shortcomings in the government's case, and explain how the government has not met their burden of proof. Thank you.
Our legal team joining us now, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Harry Litman, a former U.S. Attorney and Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President Clinton. Jill Wine-Banks, your assessment of where this case stands tonight?
I would say the case went in very well for the prosecution. The evidence, especially in the form of documents, was very strong, but so were the witnesses. Yes, Rick Gates is a flawed person, but his testimony was corroborated by the documents, and I think it's believable. And he isn't the one who benefited from all of the foreign accounts. The beneficiary was the man whose lavish lifestyle was funded by those accounts. His expenses were paid out of the foreign accounts that he didn't acknowledge at all. And so I think it went very well. My only concern is some of the remarks that the judge made, I think, were very detrimental. And some of it was taken care of by corrective instructions right before the jury went in. But it is of concern to me, and it only takes one juror for a hung jury. I don't think there's any chance that there will be an acquittal, but there is a possibility of a hung jury.
Harry Litman, 18 counts, including these counts of failing to acknowledge the foreign bank accounts, which seems to me, as I've read the testimony about it, the most open and shut part of the case. There was absolutely no defense presented on that element at all. There wasn't anything in cross-examination of the witnesses that came in from the Treasury to talk about that. And then that final sentence that the prosecutors said to the jury at the close of the case, the evidence in this case is what controls. It's the evidence that comes from that witness stand, and it leads to only one conclusion, and that is that Mr. Manafort is guilty and guilty as charged. Harry, that emphasis about the witness stand, when the defense does not call a single witness to the witness stand, is the kind of thing that lands with juries.
You know, I think it does. We, as many lawyers expected Manafort not to testify, understood with the rules of the game that he couldn't have afforded to. But I think one finds again and again when one interviews jurors, they want to hear from the accused. And they combined his sitting down with a really pretty weak, well, they haven't met their burden kind of final closing argument, which is the last card in the deck, as it were. As Jill says, the witnesses are strong, but the documents, which they'll take back with them, are particularly strong. There's really no reasonable doubt about Manafort's having lied up and down, lied to inflate income when he needed it, lied to reduce it when he wanted to get away with taxes. As Jill says, you could never know about a holdout, but it went in very well. One thing I would say, it's a very meticulous jury. They were paying a lot of attention throughout the trial, but especially today. And I think you can expect them to work through the charges one at a time, and that we not have a verdict until maybe early next week. We wouldn't be worried about the holdout scenario until a little bit after that, I think.
And Harry, with this kind of indictment and this kind of the number of counts, it would not be surprising for there to be a question or two from jury deliberation, possibly tomorrow or the next day, as they're thinking about this.
I think that's really right, especially, again, given how sort of meticulous and methodical they've been. And everyone might then say, oh, my, look at them. They're having doubts about one charge or another, especially those last 4 bank fraud charges. But I think it won't be that meaningful in the long run, even if he's convicted of, say, 14 of 18. His sentence is probably the same, and I think it registers as a resounding victory for Mueller. As long as there's not a holdout, as long as there's a result, if the jury decides to acquit on a couple charges, I think Mueller nevertheless will be satisfied.
Harry Litman, Jill Wine-Banks, thanks for joining us tonight. And
Thanks.
When we come back, on the same day that Rudy Giuliani threatened Robert Mueller that he must close down his investigation by Labor Day, Rudy Giuliani then said that the president has actually made a decision already that will lengthen the Mueller investigation by as much as a year. President Trump's TV lawyer again threatened Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigation, telling Bloomberg, if he doesn't get it done in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we will just unload on him like a ton of bricks. I thought Rudy Giuliani already unloaded all of his bricks. And tonight, the Washington Post is reporting that the president's criminal defense lawyers are working on their legal research to fight all the way to the Supreme Court if Robert Mueller issues a subpoena to President Trump to testify to a grand jury. Rudy Giuliani told the Washington Post, we would move to quash the subpoena, and we're pretty much finished with our memorandum opposing a subpoena. By we, Giuliani, of course, means Emmett Flood, the president's real lawyer working on the legal case, who would actually represent Donald Trump in court while Rudy Giuliani silently watches. Rudy Giuliani outlined 3 possible scenarios of what happens next. Plan A is we somehow work out the questioning. Plan B is we don't, and they subpoena. Plan C is they file the report and don't issue a subpoena. Joining our discussion now, Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor, and Jill Wine-Banks is back with us. And Jason Johnson, in the history of these kinds of investigations, presidents have always wanted to show they have nothing to hide. And that is part of why Bill Clinton ultimately ended up agreeing to testify rather than face a subpoena. But this president and Rudy Giuliani seem to have no problem communicating very clearly that he's got a lot to hide and a lot he doesn't want to talk about.
They're acting incredibly guilty.
Yes.
And the other problem here, Lawrence, is that they're pushing this issue. The reason that you usually end up volunteering and Clinton would sit down and talk to special prosecutors is you do not want to roll the die with the federal and constitutional crisis that might come from trying to resist a subpoena. Maybe you end up winning and then you show presidential power is stronger than you thought, the executive is stronger than you thought, and you can't be subpoenaed until you leave office. But if you lose, if it becomes apparent to your political adversaries, to the opposing party, that a president can be subpoenaed while they're in office, it would destroy anything Trump ever wants to do. So they're playing chicken right now, and they really don't have much to grill with. It's not a good idea. He should probably just submit to the questions.
And Jill, once again, some incoherence from Rudy Giuliani. Investigation must be over by September 1st. But if there's a subpoena, we will fight it, which is months and months and months if it goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
Well, he's making up the rule about September 1st, and he's not in a position to make up that rule. They can go on until this investigation is completed, and of course, the Mueller team should do that. There's no reason to stop it, and there is a reason not to do something that would interfere with the midterms, which would be, for example, if he was going to return an indictment against the president or any other sitting person who's running for election in the midterms. That you wouldn't do in October or November, probably. But you could as soon as the election is over, and so there's no reason to put an end to it. And Giuliani just makes things up. He says things that are simply not true.
And today, John Brennan said that he believes that not only must the investigation continue, but it is obviously putting more and more pressure on Donald Trump, and perhaps that's part of the behavior we're seeing Donald Trump manifest publicly. Let's listen to what John Brennan said.
It's critically important that Bob Mueller and his team of investigators be allowed to continue their work unimpeded by Mr. Trump or anyone else in the administration. It's important that Rod Rosenstein stays in charge of that investigation from a Department of Justice oversight perspective. But clearly, I think Mr. Trump is getting more and more concerned, more and more desperate, I would say more and more frightened, as there is closer and closer magnification of some of the things that those around him have been involved in.
Jason, John Brennan knows a thing or two about Donald Trump, and he thinks he's frightened.
Oh, he's terrified. Look, I mean, first off, he's got to wait on pins and needles till tomorrow morning and find out what happens with Paul Manafort. Basically, if Manafort's found guilty, which seems highly likely at this particular point, I don't think the state would have brought the case if anything could win it, then he realizes that not only does that mean that one of his closest advisors is now going to be going to jail, but also that everybody else who will be caught in Mueller's net will probably just turn on him. So the president is extremely concerned about these things, and I don't think we can ever sort of underestimate the fact that he's looking at the polls, he's looking at the internal numbers, even if they have to write them in crayon in the White House, so he'll pay attention, and it looks like Democrats may take the House. And if he thinks that Manafort and this investigation is bad now, wait until the Democrats in the House have oversight. He'll be in trouble every single week. That's why he really shouldn't be risking things with the subpoena right now. He should go in, try and get this done as fast as possible, because the Democrats will give him no quarter if they take over the House.
And Jill, do you remain confident that that Robert Mueller would prevail on a subpoena for testimony?
I am very confident on that. U.S. v. Nixon said that no one is above the law, including the president, and they allowed a subpoena for documents. And there's no real difference between making the president turn over incriminating tapes and making the president testify. Yes, there's a time issue for him to do both of those, and probably a little more for testimony. But a man who can play as much golf as this president does has enough time to prepare to be interrogated in any kind of situation before a grand jury. So I'm very sure that he would lose that one, and he would look really bad. And I think he is trying to just divert his recent episodes and this release about, that Omarosa is lying, and he's trying to divert attention. So he's now taken away the security clearance for John Brennan to divert attention from Omarosa. He is scared, and he has every reason to be scared because the evidence and the pieces of the puzzle are really fitting together.
Jill Wine-Banks and Jason Johnson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
When we come back, was Donald Trump outsmarted by Omarosa? Fox and Friends think so. Yes, Fox and Friends today said that Omarosa outsmarted their hero, Donald Trump. And our last word tonight will be a look at one of the most beautiful and moving moments in Washington, D.C. history. President Trump's morning began, as it always does, watching his favorite TV show, where he was told that Omarosa has outsmarted him.
In order to sell a book, she's come out with a series of tapes and in many ways seems to have outsmarted the president, who's taken the bait and gone out and tweeted directly after her.
Imagine Donald Trump's panic this morning when his friends at Fox and Friends declared Omarosa the winner in her battle with the president. Was that the moment that convinced Donald Trump that he had to change the story of the day? Is that why the president struck out at John Brennan today and removed his security clearance today, something he could have done at any time? The question of the day at the White House press briefing today was going to be about the president using the N-word. Here's NBC's Kristen Welker just before the briefing started today.
The other big question that we tried to get to in this briefing room yesterday, is there in fact a tape in which President Trump, when he was a citizen, used the N-word? Sarah Sanders saying that, look, she would refer us to the president's statement in which he denies it, but saying that she hadn't had a chance to ask him herself. Has she at that point? That's one of the critical questions.
But the briefing was not filled with questions about the president's racism because of the president's dramatic announcement about removing John Brennan's security clearance. And so is that the end of it? Or did Donald Trump simply get one day off from Omarosa's accusations? Omarosa is scheduled to be back on TV tomorrow. The story she has created has already transcended Omarosa and her book and is all about Donald Trump's history of racism. When we come back after this break, listen to what Donald Trump said about being black in 1989. We do not have a recording of Donald Trump using the N-word, but we do have this video from 43-year-old Donald Trump in 1989.
I've said on occasion, even about myself, if I were starting off today, I would love to be a well-educated black because I really believe they do have an actual advantage today.
And joining our discussion now, Franklin Leonard, a film executive and founder of The Blacklist, and Jason Johnson is back with us. And Franklin Leonard, there's Donald Trump in 1989 saying, I would love to be a well-educated black because I really believe they do have an actual advantage today. Any hints of racism in that?
I mean, look, I've said for several years now that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression, but it is not. And I think what's most remarkable about this is that we're not even talking about equality in any practical sense. We're talking about the hints of the beginning of progress towards equality. And yet in 1989 and still in 2018, you hear this sort of victimization narrative from the White House and also really animating the entire white supremacist movement in this country. Look, I'm very happy to be what I would imagine that Donald Trump would consider a well-educated black, but there's no evidence to back up that claim. I think Dr. Sandy Darity at Duke's actually done amazing work sort of disputing the myth that education solves the wealth gap in this country. Being a well-educated black, we'll assume that means a college graduate, roughly equates in terms of median income to being a high school dropout if you're white. I also think it's notable that this quote, this interview came, I believe it's late 1989, which is roughly contemporaneous with Trump's public comments about the Central Park Five. So at the same time he's claiming he would rather be a well-educated black, he's also calling for maximum punishment for 5 black men who were innocent of a crime, and we know that now.
Professor Jason Johnson, I think he was talking about you, if I'm listening to him, and Harvard graduate Franklin Leonard. But listen to what John O'Donnell, who I'm not related to, who worked for Donald Trump, what he wrote in his book called Trumped about Donald Trump. And this is about Donald Trump's own attitude toward educated black men working in his business. There's a passage where in the book where O'Donnell writes, quotes Trump saying, "Black guys counting my money. I hate it. I think that the guy is lazy, and it's probably not his fault because laziness is a trait in blacks." And so that's how the black accountants were treated in one of Donald Trump's casinos when he actually saw an educated black man working as an accountant.
Yeah, imagine what he thinks of non-educated black people. I mean, like, I guess Omarosa or Ben Carson. Look, here's the thing about Donald Trump. It's not just that he's a racist, right? That's already a given. It's that he's even more racist than people that we know are racist. He got sued by the Nixon administration for housing discrimination. I mean, like, Nixon came up with the Southern strategy. You know, he picked Jeff Sessions to be his attorney general. Jeff Sessions was too racist for Republicans 30 years ago. I mean, you know, in his explanation that, well, I haven't said this word or this, that, or the other. Look, at the end of the day, we don't need a tape to know that Donald Trump is racist. I was at the Unite the Right rally in Washington, D.C. on Sunday. I didn't hear anybody say the N-word, but I'm pretty sure those guys were still racist. So the idea that he can hide or dance around this, or that he makes some distinction between educated and non-educated black people, is an absolute lie.
Franklin Leonard, a wise man of show business who worked with Donald Trump in the entertainment business, knows him very well, said to me today that there's absolutely no doubt that Donald Trump pulled his move on John Brennan today to change the subject from Omarosa and make sure that the questions today were not about is there a recording of Donald Trump using the N-word.
I mean, of course he did. I mean, this is the playbook we see time and time again. Something happens. We got to have a distraction. It's fascinating that they have them on file now, ready to go, undated, ready to release. And I'm sure we'll see it many more times.
Well, because of their incompetence, it actually was dated, and it was dated July 26th. We actually see on the document that they've been sitting with this since July 26th, waiting for the day they needed to block something. And Franklin, it seems that Omarosa was what they needed to block the most.
I mean, look, I think this is just typical of the incompetence of the administration. On some level, I think I'm happy about it because it means that we actually find out the things that we need to find out. But just as the hiring of Omarosa indicates incompetence, the sort of trail that she left throughout the administration would indicate that as well. This is par for the course.
Franklin Leonard and Jason Johnson, thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And when we come back, a special last word, and that word is Aretha. Aretha Franklin has had 76 birthdays, including the day she was born. And I had the honor of attending her 2015 birthday party, where she was surrounded by family and friends. Aretha told me she'd been keeping an eye on me, meaning she'd been watching this show, and I hope she's watching tonight. We've all been thinking about Aretha this week, with her family reporting that she has been struggling with her health. And so I know that everyone watching right now, and hundreds of millions of people around the world, join me in sending our love to Aretha tonight. Aretha Franklin gets tonight's last word.
Hi, I'm Nate Ryan, host of the NASCAR and NBC podcast. Every week, we're talking to drivers, crew chiefs, and other personalities in the NASCAR industry. So subscribe to the NASCAR and NBC podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts.